Proverbs 4:23, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life, okay? Your heart is the fountain. Your heart is driving things. And we've got Mark chapter 7, that verse, for from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, and that is the beginning of our problems. We think with our hearts, and we think wrongly. Anyone know where this quote comes from? The heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing. If you're French, you might know that's Blaise Pascal. And you might think that Pascal is anti-reason. He's not anti-reason. He's just saying that we think with our hearts. And of course, modern psychologists are noticing this. Modern psychologists are noticing people like Jonathan Haidt, author of The Righteous Mind. He is a moral psychologist who says the human person is like an elephant with a rider on it. That's his analogy for it. The elephant is your gut level desires. You want certain things to be true. And this is where all your cognitive biases come from. Why do we think wrongly? Because we have our hearts set on the wrong things. So as I'm scrolling through Facebook and I see a headline about, I don't know, the US election or something, and I want a certain person to get into the White House, then I will discount every headline that disconfirms my bias. I won't even look into it. It won't even, at times it won't even register for me. But every piece of data that I come across that confirms what I already love, well, of course, it just proves that I was right all along. If you want something to be true, you set the bar of evidence very low. If you don't want something to be true, you set the bar of evidence very high. Now, we all think that we're evidence-driven. We all think we're rational. And to a degree, we are. It's just that our hearts have already set the threshold of evidence. And if we want something to be true, we set the bar very, very, very low. All our cognitive biases come from this elephant, these instinctual gut loves. And so Jonathan Haidt says the elephant wants to go this way. And our rationality is a tiny little rider on top of the elephant that's saying, this way, elephant, this way. Rarely does the elephant listen to the rider. And what we have in the culture wars, what we have as people debate with one another is we've got two riders on top and they're spouting whatever they want to spout. And they're making their arguments up here. But really you need to talk to the elephants because the elephants are in charge. I've just realized I've made the US politics kind of analogy, and elephant has a different connotation. This is not a pro-Republican commentary. It's all about the elephants though, not in the US politics sense. It's all about these gut instincts. And so many of the findings of the social sciences these days are just confirming what the Bible has been teaching for thousands and thousands of years, that it all begins in the heart, and your heart does your thinking for you. If that's the case, then how should we proclaim the gospel to people? Well, Blaise Pascal, you might think it's a modern problem that people despise Christianity. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century discovered exactly the same thing, okay? He said men despise religion back in his day. He said they hate it and are afraid it may be true. The cure for this is to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show them that it is. I'm just going to zero in on that last bit. Make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show them that it is. Well, this is what Jonathan Haidt would say, right? Because if you want something to be true, the power of evidence you've got to get over is much lower. And if people don't want it to be true, the bar goes way up. If you were listening to my talk this morning, in the Q&A, people asked me about, evidence for the resurrection. And I sort of mentioned very briefly in my talk. You know, here are these 5 historical facts, and Jesus definitely died, he was definitely put in that tomb, and it was definitely that tomb, and that tomb was definitely empty, and the disciples had experiences of the risen Christ, and those experiences stopped, and then they gave their lives confirming, you know, all these, you know, bare historical facts. And I made a plea not to rest on those bare historical facts, because if somebody doesn't want this to be true, you're not going to be able to back them into a corner with 2,000-year-old historical facts like that. You need to paint a far bigger picture in order to proclaim the resurrection. Make it attractive, make good people wish it were true, and then show them that it is. This was Pascal's way, and I think we should follow it. Thomas Cranmer, author of the English prayer book, here's a prayer that is said at morning prayer. Thomas Cranmer gets people to pray, "Almighty God, unto whom all hearts be open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hidden. Cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we may perfectly love you and worthily magnify your holy name through Christ our Lord. Amen." What is his anthropology? What is his doctrine of humanity? We are heart-driven creatures. Somebody summarized Thomas Cranmer's Reformed anthropology as this: what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. That's how we tick. You think, no, I am mind-driven. I think very clearly about things, and I weigh up the pros and cons, and then I make my choice, and I don't care about how I feel about it. You know, some of you will say to me, no, I am a very rational person. To which I say, no, you love being a rational person. You love considering yourself to be a rational person. That vision has captured your heart, but you are not rational. We are all heart-driven. We are all heart-driven. What the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. And as we come to a world, and as we try to proclaim the good news to it, they already live within an imaginary. They already have certain beliefs about things that are so obvious to them, there's no arguing them out of it. Okay, and I just thought of a few today to put on the PowerPoint slide. Okay, it is obvious to everybody. You don't need to make a reasoned argument for this. It's just obvious that freedom is the paramount value. Sure, you've got your journey, and I can't judge. That's obvious. If it's not harming anyone, it cannot be wrong. That's obvious, right? If it's not harming anyone, right? Of course, it can't be wrong if it's not harming anyone. You don't need to argue for that. Everybody knows that is part of this pre-critical assumption that is heart-driven, that is very instinctual, that is the frame through which we view the world. I look within to find my true identity. You can't tell me who I am. I discover who I am by plunging deeply into the dark waters of Lake Me, right? That's how I find my true identity. I need to cut the toxic people out of my life. It just seems obvious to so many people. I love the Babylon Bee headline from a few years ago. It's like, God cuts the toxic people out of his life, 7 billion people die. But it seems obvious to everybody. You know, I need to cut the toxic people out of my life. Science and faith are at loggerheads. It seems obvious to people. You know why I think it's hard to reason people out of this science versus faith imagined punch-up? It's so difficult to reason someone out of the science versus faith punch-up, as though they're in conflict. People just assume they're in conflict. But you can't reason someone out of a position they haven't been reasoned into. Nobody is reasoned into that position. It's just obvious, right? It's obvious that science and faith are at loggerheads. It's obvious that religion causes wars. It's obviously that Christianity is repressive, especially concerning sex. And it's obvious that Christianity is a spent force in the world. Now, obviously, this is a Western kind of imaginary, but this is just so obvious to people. And you'll find it very difficult to reason people out of these positions. And you will find it difficult to reason people out of these positions because nobody was ever reasoned into these positions. These positions are assumed. This is part of the story that we live in. So how do we go about preaching the gospel into this world? We cast down imaginations, says the Apostle Paul. Okay, 2 Corinthians 10. We war, not by the flesh, not by violence or force, but we do go to war with the sword of the Spirit, and by argumentation, by reason, by storytelling, by words, we tell a very different story. I've gone backwards. How do I go forwards? It seems obvious to me that the mind is not a debating chamber, it is a picture gallery. The mind is not a Wikipedia page, it's an IMAX cinema. This seems obvious to me. And I think it's the way that biblical characters operate. So if you were to convict David of his adultery against Bathsheba, what would you do? You know, perhaps you would go in with the law. Perhaps you'd go in with an exposition of the 10 Commandments. That's what Nathan could have done. Here's what Nathan actually did. The Lord sent Nathan to David. Let me read it because the pictures, your beautiful faces are over the top of this. I can't properly read it. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. Okay, he's really like drawing on the pathos. Yeah. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Wow. Now, a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man. He's just a poor man, right? And he prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house, to you and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if all of this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord? So what does Samuel do? Samuel tells a story. And in telling the story, what Samuel does is immerse David in the real world. David has been living in this imaginary world in which he is king and he can do whatever he likes. And how do you get David, how do you cast down his imagination and bring him into the real world in which who he really is the bad guy? How do you convince him that he is one of the baddies? Okay, there's a famous sketch by some comedians, Robert Webb and David Mitchell, and look it up online. It's just a hilarious end of the war, realizing that they as Nazis are the baddies, and they turn to one another and they realize that there are skulls in their uniforms, and they had never considered that they were the baddies. No one ever thinks they're the baddies. And so what makes the scene so hilarious is they come to the conclusion that no one ever comes to. That's why it's hilarious. That's why we laugh at it. Because they have this moment of going, hang on, are we the baddies? And then they run away and we assume that they surrender and become goodies, right? But no one ever thinks they're the baddies. David didn't think he was a baddie. How do you convince him that he's a baddie? Take him out of his imaginary world and put him into the real world. But fascinatingly, how do you put him into the real world? You tell a story. You tell this fairy tale story that never happened. Nathan immerses David in reality by telling him a story that never actually happened. But that is more real than the imagination David had been living in. And he tells a story. And of course, when you tell a story, you don't just take the moral high ground, you take all the ground. You're determining everything. You're determining every single character. You know, here's a poor man, and here's a little ewe lamb, and here is this nasty traveler, and well, here's this traveler, and here's this nasty neighbor, right? You define the entire world. You are a sub-creator. You are like God, inventing a world, and you draw them in, and he draws them in with pathos. And he says, it's just a little lamb, and it goes to sleep in his arms. Are you picturing a lamb in the arms of this poor man? He draws you in, and then he positions you right at the end. He says, you are that guy. You are the baddie. Nathan doesn't just grab the high ground, the moral high ground. He grabs all the ground, immerses David in this different world, and points out where David truly is. He's not the good king. He is the wicked neighbor. And this is what we can do. This is why we tell stories. We tell stories not as an escape from reality, but as a way of immersing people in the true reality. It's how people work, it's how God works, it's how the gospel goes out. I was going to take you through a few other examples, but we probably don't have time, but for you to consider later. In Luke chapter 10, a teacher of the law said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And after having a back and forth with him, what does Jesus do? He tells a story. He tells a story about a man who falls, and the law and the priests don't help him, but a beautiful stranger helps him and sets him on his feet. I think, ultimately it's the story of Christ, actually. I think the Good Samaritan is Christ. You can ask me a question about that if you like. But, and then he says, I love this. Verse 36, Jesus says, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Whose sandals is Jesus wanting the teacher of the law to put himself in? He's actually meant to first put himself in the sandals of the man left for dead. First of all, says Jesus, consider yourself to be the man left for dead. And the Levite and the priest are no help to you. The whole of the law is no help to you whatsoever. The old covenant is no help to you whatsoever. But a beautiful stranger comes and lifts you up and raises you up and heals you. So first put yourself in the sandals of that man. Jesus immerses him in a world, and then he says, who are you in the story? Tell you who you are. You're the dead man. Because I think Christ is the Good Samaritan. But then he says, okay, so you are the one on whom mercy was shown. Now you go and do likewise. Now you go and be a Good Samaritan yourself. Okay, but Jesus paints the picture, establishes the world, and points out where this man ought to be. You go and do likewise. Stories do that. Stories, maybe as I've been thinking about stories and talking about stories, you've been thinking about this man, C.S. Lewis. I wonder how many people have come to faith through mere Christianity. Many people have come to faith through C.S. Lewis's writing, Mere Christianity. But I wonder how many people have come to faith through the Chronicles of Narnia as well. And even with Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis is constantly capturing your imagination, constantly using metaphor and simile and story. And the way he came to faith was by considering stories. You might know that he had a famous conversation with Tolkien in 1931. I think it was September 19th, 1931. And they were talking about the great myths that both Tolkien and Lewis loved. They loved these myths. They taught these myths. They would go on to write myths of their own. But Lewis said these myths are lies, even though breathed through silver. Beautiful way of putting it. But, they are beautiful, but they are false. And Tolkien said, no, they are not lies. And this absolutely rocked Lewis's world, because he always loved the story of the dying and the rising God in all that great mythology. But he thought that that was just distraction. And Tolkien says, no, the reason why it resonates with you is that it's not distraction. It's immersing you in reality. It's a way of catching you off guard, waking you up from your imaginary world and plunging you into what's real. What is real is that there is a dying and rising God and a happily ever after. They had this conversation on the 19th of September, 1931, and Lewis went away from it, and within a matter of weeks, he was converted because he came to see that what Tolkien says, the gospel contains a fairy story or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. But this story has entered history. It is the true myth. Lewis goes and reads through the Gospels, and then as he's reading through the Gospels, he says they had not the mythical taste. And by that, he doesn't mean that what was absent from it was the dying and rising God, this storytelling aspect. What he was saying is that when Luke starts to write his Gospel, he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, and I have studied this, and I've got the reporting from the eyewitnesses. So they had not the mythical taste in that sense. It's not once upon a time in a land far, far away. Jesus went from this named town to that named town, and this person was the governor, and that person was the tetrarch, and this person, paid this amount of money to that person, and so it's historical reportage, but it is telling the grandest myth of all. It's the myth that really happened. He says, I'm too experienced in literary criticism to regard the Gospels as myth in the sense of just make-believe, but this is the true myth. It's not less than a myth, it's more than a myth. The story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us in the same way as the others, but with the tremendous difference that it really happened. Tolkien says, there is no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. There's a big fat book by Christopher Brooker called The 7 Basic Stories. And he just says, look, here are the stories that we always tell. And you almost can't not tell these kinds of stories. There's Overcoming the Monster, there's Rags to Riches, there's The Quest, there's The Voyage and the Return, tragedy, comedy, and rebirth. And why is that? Why do we know when a story goes wrong? Why do we know when an ending is really unsatisfying? Why should it be unsatisfying? There's nothing wrong with ending a film this way or that way, is there? Well, we kind of think there is. We kind of think there are archetypes that ought to be obeyed, or at least honored. Why should these be the stories? Why should this be the shape of a good story? Well, perhaps because the Prince of Heaven went from riches to rags and back to riches again in order to overcome the monster. That was the great quest from heaven. He went on a voyage and returned back to the Father's side. He embraced our tragedy to give us true comedy so that we might all be reborn. Maybe all the stories we tell are like this because we're living in a story. It's worth considering. How do you turn this to evangelistic good? Well, a couple of Easters ago, we made this little video about the myth that really happened. Let's have a look.
When I teach kids, sometimes I tell them the best story in the world ever. It goes like this. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom of light ruled by a generous king. The princess was as wise as she was fair, and all the people were very happy. The end. Of course, the children know that's not the best story in the world ever. The best story in the world involves struggle. So the story continues. One day, the princess noticed the door to the dungeon was ajar. She knew she shouldn't, but lower and lower she descends until she sees, chained to the wall, a dazzling dragon. The dragon said,
"Don't yell, I need your help."
Help?
says the princess.
My father told me you came to destroy our kingdom.
Destroy? No, I came to free you. I came to teach you to fly. And if you release me, I'll teach you.
With quivering hands, she pulled the lever, releasing the shackles, and snap! The dragon grabbed her in his talons and carried her off to his lair across the sea. Distraught, the king asks the knights of the realm.
Who will rescue my daughter?
None of them were brave enough, except a simple shepherd from the hills. The king said,
You! I will make you a knight. Bring back the princess.
So the newly made knight sailed through deadly storms. He fought terrible monsters. He climbed perilous mountains, and he came to the dragon's lair. In an almighty fight to the death, the knight was completely overpowered, and when it looked like all was lost, somehow he trapped the dragon in the cell that had held the princess. The dragon was defeated, the princess was saved, and they returned to the kingdom of light. With joy, the king received back his daughter, and she received the knight as her husband. So they all lived happily ever after. That's the best story in the world ever, because it's every story. It's the great quest, it's overcoming the monster, it's rags to riches, it's love lost and then found, it's tragedy turned to comedy, and the happily ever after. Perhaps these stories thrill our hearts because they echo a true story. Perhaps there really is an ultimate hero who came on a mission to fight evil, to give up his life, to rise again and to be one with his people forever. What if the fairy tale is true? What if Jesus is the hero of heroes? What if Easter is the myth that really happened?
So it was good enough for C.S. Lewis to see that you resonate with all these stories because we're living in a story. Maybe the hero has come. So let's go through these things. We all know the shape of a good story, law and gospel, essentially. Joseph Campbell spoke about the hero's journey, but he was just drawing on the prophetic tradition and the scriptural tradition in which you dive down into a great abyss. And then from there, somehow you are raised up and you come back to where you began a little bit wiser. And the ending was greater than the beginning, and somehow the journey was all worth it. This is why every Hollywood Marvel film, every superhero film is so similar, right? Because, this was popularized in Hollywood, and screenwriters just took this and they're playing the playbook cynically, step by step. And, you know what happens. The hero looks like he's been punched to the ground so many times, there's no way he's going to get up. The Good Friday moments, right? And then, dun, 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 and he's a battle-scarred warrior, and he does it all for the girl, and they get together at the end. You know how it works, right? You know how it works because this is the world we live in. We live in this story, and actually telling made-up stories can be the best way of immersing people in actual reality. I did have a couple of examples. Let's not do the examples, but that was a Christmas film called He Came Down that we filmed, an Easter film that we did called Cannonball. Let's just do the ending to this Christmas film. How do you put this into practice? I've always loved, there's a story that I think explains Christmas so beautifully. It's this apocryphal tale of what if the shepherds came to the manger, they came to Bethlehem, and they'd all brought a gift except one shepherd. One shepherd hasn't brought anything. He didn't know he needed to, and he's feeling very awkward and very out of sorts. And all the other shepherds are making fun of him. What did you bring for the king? He's the king. What have you brought for him? Oh, sorry. And then the Magi turn up, and he feels really bad at this stage. They're giving gold, frankincense, and myrrh. He's got nothing. And so as Joseph is receiving the gold and the frankincense, Mary needs to receive the myrrh. So she needs to offhand Jesus. She needs to give Jesus to somebody. Who's she going to give Jesus to? Well, the empty-handed shepherd, right? He's the only one she can give Jesus to, because he's the only one who's come empty. But he comes empty to the Nativity, and he is given Christ himself. Beautiful story, isn't it? Don't come to Jesus full. Come to Jesus empty-handed, and you'll be given everything. You'll be given Christ himself. That is the meaning of Christmas. So how do we bring that to life? Well, we thought, I know, how about we have a modern 21st century shepherd who's out of sorts? He's the boyfriend who's having Christmas with his girlfriend's parents, and he doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't understand any of the etiquette of their way of doing Christmas. He's feeling like an outsider, but we need him to kind of go through this wardrobe into the 1st century, into true Narnia. And this is what we did with Meet the Nativity. We're halfway through the episode.
Sorry. Welcome.
Please, come in.
What did you bring? And where are you from?
I'm from Finchley. Wait, what? Is this? Are you? Is he? Is she?
Finchley. No, I've never heard of this place. Did you come far to see him?
It's on the Northern Line. Him.
You have brought him a gift.
I have nothing.
Would you like to hold him?
Please.
Come, come.
Okay. Okay. Got a name?
Yes, we played it for last. But I should probably stop it there. How do I come up? Can you see me?
Yes, we can see
Can
you.
you see me? Yes, on full screen.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, great. So immerse people in the story. That's the way you'll wake them up to actual reality. There we go. If you guys want to come join us at Speak Life, you can check out speaklifefoundry.com. What kind of questions do people have?
That's great, Glenn. Thank you. We have a couple here. So the first one is going back to what you said at the very start. So someone asks, what you say about the heart is true. I'm constantly fighting with loves other than Christ and constantly failing. How can I preach Jesus as the solution, which my head knows he is, without being a total hypocrite?
You're not a hypocrite precisely because you're naming this struggle, okay? We do not love Jesus the way we ought, but the gospel is not, you haven't loved Jesus enough, now you really need to love Jesus enough. Well, how much is enough, right? That would be an even more condemning gospel than to say you haven't obeyed the law enough. now you need to obey the law enough, right? Because if external obedience was difficult, how much more difficult is internal devotion? My goodness, like what a legalistic burden you can put on people if you say that you are saved by your devotion, or even that you growing, it is not. Okay, we are not exchanging a works-based. We are not exchanging a works-based legalism for a heart-based legalism. First thing you need to know is you are already in the embrace of Jesus Christ. You are loved with the very love with which the Father loves the Son. How does the Father love the Son? He loves him eternally. He loves him unimprovably. He loves him unbreakably. You are loved with that love. John 15, Jesus says, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. You are in on an eternal Niagara Falls of blessing from the Father to the Son, in whom you are now wrapped up and filled with the Spirit. Okay? So, you know what discipleship now is for you? It is continually looking away from your sluggish heart and looking to Jesus, not as a way of earning that love, but as a this is why Thomas Cranmer's prayer, Almighty God, unto whom all hearts be open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse that love you, wordily magnify your holy name. So we're constantly aware of how far short we fall in all these ways. But the way in which we stir love for God is by reminding ourselves of the unbreakable, unconditional love that we already have from him. That's why you open your Bible. That's why you go to church. That's why you pray. That's why you do all these things, to remember 1 John, we love because he first loved us. And we've got to do that first thing all the time. He first loves us, even in all our lovelessness.
That's great. Thanks, Glenn. So another one is back to stories. So what extent can stories be based directly on what is written in the Bible, or should they be pointing to Jesus, the true story, so out with the Bible?
Well, there are plenty of stories in the Bible that, in one sense or another, I guess they are about Christ, because the whole scriptures are about Christ. But there are plenty of stories that Jesus himself tells that are about stuff in the world. So I don't think you should be bound by, and I don't think every story needs to be like an allegory. You might know sort of John Bunyan is one of the best-selling books in the English language. And he was a great Puritan who told this allegory of Christian's journey towards the celestial city. It's like it wasn't even an allegory. It was just so bashy around the head, obvious. I need someone to play the character of a Christian. I know. Let's call him Christian. and everything that happens to him is just very obvious. And sometimes I think evangelicals think that that's the only kind of storytelling that's allowed. You need to have a very clear Jesus figure who can never do anything wrong, and you need to have a very clear Satan figure. You need to have a very clear cross moment and a resurrection moment, and it needs to have this one-to-one correspondence. Whereas, look at what Tolkien did. Look at what Lewis and Tolkien are good examples of. I guess Lewis was towards the more literal end of things. Aslan is Christ, right? He's the son of the emperor across the sea. Whereas in Middle Earth, Tolkien doesn't have a Christ figure, but he does have Frodo, the suffering servant, and he does have Aragorn, the returning king, and he does have Gandalf, the risen Lord, right? And he's pointing us to very deep Christian reality, but not in that one-for-one way. So I don't think it needs to always be the obvious allegory, no.
Thanks, Glenn. And you are excellent at sharing stories, and you're an excellent storyteller, which we appreciated this morning, which we have appreciated this afternoon. What would you say to someone who is not so good at storytelling? how can they use other gifts in transferring stories or trying to do evangelism online, especially online in these days?
Well, I'd question whether you're not a good storyteller. Just watch yourself. Just maybe at the end of today, think through the conversations you had and ask yourself, did I tell any stories? Did I make any similes, any metaphors? Did I say anything was like anything else? I would question whether you're not a good storyteller. I think we all tell stories all the time, but you don't need to go off and make films because Speak Life has made them for you. No, but you can hit the share button. You can find great stuff. Go chattervideos.com. They have a whole bunch of videos from Speak Life and from a whole bunch of other different Christian creators. Go chattervideos.com. And if you've got a Facebook account, my goodness, what a platform that you have. And if you give it a little, I was so blessed by this, or, this really got me thinking, why don't you have a watch? Put that on your Facebook and see what happens. And I'm realizing more and more that people just need to be told, hit the share button. And if you do hit the share button, you are part of something that really could go viral. So you don't have to create these, these kind of storytelling opportunities. You can pass them on, and we're all commanded to pass on the story. There are lots of ways that you can get excited about this kind of stuff and use it in your own witness. Yeah.
Okay, someone has just said, we might not have time to use the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy as an example. Can you give an example of how to use this in a really quick sentence, 2 sentences, short conversation snippet about the gospel?
So I do kind of like the love story thing, like the little animation that I played you in the middle. When I go into schools, I kind of do with kids. I take assemblies sometimes and I say, come on, kids, let's do a choose your own adventure fairy tale. Let's tell the best story in the world ever. And I kick it off, and then they tell me which way the story should go. And I say, there's a kingdom of light and life and love, and there's a beautiful princess and a great king. The end. Is that a good story? And all the kids know, no, that's not a good story. And so I say, well, what should happen? Should something nice or nasty happen at that point? And everybody knows something nasty should happen at that point. Everybody knows that. That's the shape of the story, right? There's a fall. Everybody knows that. So then you tell the dragon takes the girl off. And what should happen then? Should the king say, easy come, easy go, plenty more princesses where that came from? Or should there be a rescue? No, there should be a rescue. Who should go? Well, maybe that shepherd boy. Should it be an easy crossing to get to the other side, or should it be a difficult crossing? It should be a difficult crossing. Should it be easy to fight the dragon, or difficult? It should be really difficult. It should be, snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. And then when he gets her and he brings her home to the king, what should happen next? Everybody knows what should happen next. People will suggest, they should get married. And I always insist, only if she wants to. She's been through a massive ordeal. She'll need to process all sorts of complicated feelings for the dragon. There'll have to be a 12-step program. But if after all of that, if she still wants to marry, they should get married, and it's a happily ever after. And we know that is the shape of the story. Why do we know that's the shape of the story? So I do it in those sorts of times.
Great, thank you. That sounds much more exciting than just the end. So I'm sure everyone will be loving to hear your stories like that, to listen to them. And
just on that, if people ask about the suffering issue, they say, well, why would God create a world in which there's suffering? I often say, well, look, we run the experiment we have run this experiment millions of times. There are millions of creators of worlds. Every writer, every author, every storyteller is a creator of a world. And in no world is there just the kingdom of light and life and love and then the end. There is always the fall. There is always a hero's journey. There is always struggle, right? No one has ever created a world in which there isn't that kind of shape. And it's certainly not a knockdown argument for God's existence in the face of suffering, but it certainly makes you think, if God is the great storyteller, what kind of story is he telling? He's telling the shape of a story that goes down into a deep pit, as all stories run.
Great, Glenn, thank you. This might be our last question, so I'm going to kind of combine two together. So someone, part A, asks, how can we tell stories without manipulating the audience? And part B, what kind of non-biblical story or illustration would you use to make people see that they are the baddies?
There is a problem with manipulation. Interestingly, Nathan didn't mind saying he's a little ewe lamb and he falls asleep in the poor man's arms every night. He's definitely going for an emotional response, and it's okay to go for an emotional response because the world is being discipled by storytellers who are definitely going for emotional responses. And we might think that there is a wrong way of doing that, but the right way is not to deny the heart, deny the emotional aspect, deny pathos. Biblically, people tell stories to evoke heartfelt responses, and we shouldn't be shy of doing that ourselves. How do you make people see that they are the baddies? You know, quite often, I talked about the science versus faith kind of understand. We kind of think that science and faith are at loggerheads and they're in this fight. So I kind of tell this story. Imagine Betty the botanist is in her lab, and Gareth the lab assistant comes in the next morning, and Betty says, "Thank you so much for giving me that botanical specimen yesterday. It's been so helpful. I've run all these tests on it. I've mapped its genome. I've discovered so much about the botanical specimen." And then Gareth says, "What are you talking about? Yesterday was February the 14th. It was Valentine's Day. I gave you a long-stemmed rose, Betty. Do you understand what I gave to you?" And the question is, does Betty understand the rose? And on one level, she understands it brilliantly scientifically. On the romantic level, Betty is a moron. And I tell that story usually when I've got a whole bunch of scientists in the room who think, who think that they are very clever and that science is like antithetical to faith. I put them in the story. I asked them to consider the characters. What do you think of Betty? Everyone agrees that Betty is the moron. But if you think that you have exhaustively understood this world simply by mapping its genome and putting it under a microscope, you are like Betty. Don't be like Betty, right? Because what if this world is like that long stem rose? What if it is a gift from somebody communicating love to us? Then you can go into the laboratory and you can understand it scientifically, but that does not exhaust the meaning of the rose any more than the scientific analysis of this world exhausts the meaning of this world. You surely don't think that you've exhausted the meaning of this world by simply doing good science, do you? You're not like Betty, are you? Right? You've immersed them in that story. And if they are, if they have bought into scientism, then they're basically confessing to being Betty. They're one of the baddies at that stage. So there's a little example of it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Glen. We really, really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon and this morning to come to speak to us at FEUER. And I'm afraid now that we've just scared you off. But we all really appreciate Glen and what he had to teach us today. And I know that you have many questions, some of which we didn't get the chance to ask. But do go and visit the resources that he linked at the very beginning of the chat. And do continue to keep coming to our FEUER events later this evening and tomorrow as well. Thank you so much, and we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody.